Hi, my name is Mike Frisch, a psychology professor at Baylor University. With me today is Dr. Alex Michalos. Today is November 12th, 2004, and we're at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. This project of oral history is made possible through the generous support of the Gallup International Positive Psychology Center and the International Society for Quality of Life Studies. Dr. Michalos of the University of Northern British Columbia was trained in logic and philosophy of science at the University of Chicago. Over the past 30 years, he's published 23 books and 85 articles. He became a preeminent researcher and pioneer in quality of life by trying to answer Plato's question of, what is the good life? Dr. Michalos, can you tell me a little bit about your childhood?
My childhood. I was born in Cleveland. My father was a Greek immigrant from the island of Chios, and my mother was born in Akron, Ohio, and her parents were born in Italy. And I have one brother. How much history do you want? that was the beginning.
Okay, I'm curious about what your home life, home atmosphere was like growing up.
It was very much working class. Both my parents ended their education at grade 8, which was fairly typical at that time, at least for working class people. My father drove a truck. Well, when he originally came to the United States, he went to the steel mills in Gary, Indiana. Then he moved up to the steel mills in Pittsburgh. And then he moved up to driving a truck for Nabisco, bread and pastry and that kind of stuff. He did that for 17 years. And then he bought a small hamburger joint and worked it up to a bigger hamburger joint, basically. And my mother, remember her, she sewed communion veils for the May Company in Cleveland, and she sang in the Cleveland Opera Company. And I had a brother who was 2.5 years older than me. More?
Well, what was their attitude about education?
Oh, that was very clear. My father always said, and over again, get a good education so you don't have to put up with what I put up with. And the funny thing is they told that was over and over to my brother and I, but I was the only one that got the education. My brother stopped in high school too, but I went on. I believed them, and they were right. It's much better to get more education.
Did you have any special hobbies or interests as a kid?
As a kid, I was a jock through high school and university. I went to university for 3 reasons. I wanted to run in the Olympics and play professional football, and I wanted to be with my girlfriend. And by the second year of university, I realized I was not fast enough to run in the Olympics or good enough to play professional football. And my girlfriend found somebody else. So at that point, I became very philosophical. And in fact, I majored in philosophy starting at that point, about midway through university.
Can you tell me a little bit about what sparked your interest in philosophy and sociology, besides these major life events you're talking about?
Yeah, I was impressed when by Plato's Republic, and it was a required course actually. We had distribution requirements in our university, and one of them was this arts requirement that you could take religion or you could take philosophy. So I took philosophy because I had heard there were Greek philosophers. And I was impressed by Plato, and I was impressed by the questions that he was asking about what is a good life. And it's a funny thing because it was just another class and I was just another student. Sorry, I get misty sometimes,
Uh-huh.
but something went right.
Huh.
And that was really the beginning. I mean, he was asking, what is a good life?
Uh-huh.
And it was like he was asking me.
Huh.
And so I drank deeply into Plato, and that was the beginning of it. And
So it really moved you.
yeah, and it still does.
Uh-huh.
Funny.
Uh-huh.
That's a funny thing.
And so where did you move from that? Your undergraduate, was this a freshman class or something you took, or sophomore?
It was an introductory class, and I took it, I think, my second year in university. And then I majored in philosophy and history, and I went on to study history of religions. And then I got interested, while I was in graduate school at Chicago, I got interested in logic and philosophy of science. Partly it was I was interested in getting better tools to study what a good life might be. And I thought that the scientists had a better idea, could give me a better set of tools than I was getting from philosophy. But philosophy started with the questions, but then I needed the science, I think, to get the tools to answer the questions. And I think Plato would have done the same thing if he'd have had
If you had those methodological tools.
if he'd had an array of options that we had as students, I think he would have gone that way.
Can you tell me then how you got interested in quality of life and the survey research and methodology, the sociological methodological piece?
Yeah, that was my doctoral dissertation was on logical foundations of probability. So I was reading a lot of probability theory and statistical theory, and I was specializing then on decision making. And at that time, when I was just finishing my degree, the buzzword was decision making. That was when Herbert Simon was very popular, and administrative behavior and that kind of stuff, March and Simon. And then the second buzzword that came around was the late 60s, it was social indicators. And I found that there were a whole bunch of people interested in the good life and interested in applying statistical machinery and social scientific machinery to answering those questions about the good life.
Who inspired you in that regard? Who did you look up to in someone looking at social indicators at that
Two
early
main
date?
people. Simon was very important, I think, and the American pragmatists generally, people like John Dewey, who was much earlier than Simon. But Dewey was one of those people who was an academic bridge person. I mean, if you look at the biography of John Dewey, besides being very productive academically, he was organizing, starting organizations like the AUCC. AUCC is probably Canadian, American Association of University Professors.
Yes.
That was one of John Dewey's babies. But he was active in the American Civil Liberties Union. There's a whole bunch of activist kinds of things that Dewey did. And when I looked for models of what kind of academic I wanted to be, it was Dewey.
Yes, and you've always had that kind of rubric to your work where you wanted research that made a difference, that impacted society. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's been a core. And later on, as you go through life, you find other people riding the same horse, and so I did that too. I discovered the Fabians, who were a kind of a social democratic bunch in Britain, who started in the 1880s. George Bernard Shaw was one of their founders, and I always liked Shaw and his work. And he had the same kind of, he was not a scientist, but he hung around with scientists. But he had the same kind of attitude about how you should live your life. And I mean, he was a playwright, but he was interested in the world around him. And I think that I'm an academic who's interested in the world around me.
So you made this kind of leap. It may have been quite gradual, but from the decision-making research to some actual, was it actual survey research that you
Yeah.
began? Do you remember? When exactly did that start, and what did you do initially to get your research going on
This-
quality of life?
The survey research started in about mid-70s. At the University of Guelph, we had a group called the Rural Development Outreach Project, and was funded by Kellogg's. I remember it was $1.5 million, and the people who got the money originally were people that I ate lunch with, and so we were talking about this, and there were issues that they were interested in, and they had the same kind of, well, I mean, it was called Rural Development Outreach, and so I just naturally started to work with those people, and they were committed to survey research, and I knew a lot about statistics, and so I began doing survey research with them, and I found that I enjoyed the empirical research even more than the theoretical stats that I was doing. And that was the beginning of it, and also was one of the strange things about that project was that even though they had $1.5 million, there were only about 10 people in that university interested in working on that project, which I thought was extraordinary. But that was the beginning, and then that group that worked so well on rural development outreach, we were the core group that started the School of Rural Planning at Guelph, and we were the core group that started the Gerontology Research Center. And the reason those things happened wasn't just the money, but the reason they happened is because we worked well together. And I think that's a key issue with group research anyway. If you have a few people who can work really well together, they can do a lot in a short time.
Well, I'm intrigued by the idea of you're lunching with people from different disciplines. So you're a philosopher at this time, is that right?
Yes.
Or you're
Yeah,
in the
that's why
philosophy
I was-
department?
Yes.
But you're lunching with, is it sociologists? Or?
Yeah, they were sociologists and geographers and historians. I almost never ate with philosophers after the first few years. I mean, and it was a design policy. I thought, I'm in this university with all these other disciplines, and they're all eating by themselves. And so, and you go into the faculty club, and you could see each table had a different discipline. So I started making the rounds of the tables systematically to meet people that saw the world the way I did, and that paid off. Actually, Herb Simon says in his biography, when someone asked him about his success, he said the most important thing is find smart people and hang around them.
That's
and
wonderful.
I did the same thing.
Interesting way to become a Renaissance man or woman, just sort of who you lunch with, I guess. Well, let me ask you this. Are there any other milestones in your work then, once this Rural Survey Research Group got along and you've had such an illustrious career? Any other major milestones you can tell us about in your work?
There were two, I guess, and they were both organizational things. So one was finding my way into the International Sociological Association. That group meets every 4 years, like the International Psych Association meets every 4 years. And I met people from all around the world, many of whom are in MIQOLS now.
And that's the International Society for Quality of Life Studies?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah, that's the group that we're here with. And what that international group did for me was allowed me to see what was going on in other parts of the world and to identify real people in other parts of the world doing the same kind of research. And then the second thing was when this group was formed, maybe a decade ago or so, it was the same kind of thing. I remember talking to Joe Sergi when he first organized this group. He was in the core group, and I told him that I admired what he had done, because we had been meeting since 1972 in the International Sociological Association, and our meetings, our business meetings would take about 10 minutes long, and they'd say, who wants to be president now? And you look around the room, well, you do it, you did it last time, you can do it this time. That's where we did it. But we had no organization at all. And but this group with Sergey and Samley and that initial core of Leon Schifflin and Elaine.
Elaine Sherman.
Yeah, but they did what we couldn't do.
It's a wonderful thing. And that really gave you a leg up in your work.
Yeah.
Any other milestones in your...
Now those are the two biggest ones. Well, in 1973, I started the journal Social Indicators Research, and Wolfgang Zapp invited me to Bad Homburg for a conference, and that's where I met Glotzer for the first time. And Glotzer was just finished his dissertation, and he was working with Zapp. But that was really a good connection. So from '73 to now, well, that's 30 years that I've known Wolfgang, the both Wolfgangs. And that's been a really good connection because we've been focused on this kind of research since then.
Any other large-scale studies you want to tell us about?
The two large-scale studies I did was the first one. People asked me when I moved to Canada from the States, my friends in the States asked me, what's the difference? So I spent 12 years answering that question, and I wrote this 5-volume treatise called North American Social Report, and comparing the two countries, and it was something like 1,500 pages. My recollection, something like 146 indicators, but I looked at health and crime and transportation and education and science and leisure. I looked at every Gallup poll that I could find in both countries where the same items had been asked, and I looked at all the polls coming out of the Survey Research Center at the University of Michigan and out of the NORC from the University of Chicago. I looked at every single poll I could find.
That's a lot of data.
Yeah.
Sift through.
And it was for the decade 1964 to 74. And I came to the conclusion that quality of life was better in Canada, of course. But the project was so big and so complicated that I didn't know until the end who was going to win. So it was an interesting horse race, actually. And the other big project was the one you mentioned, the 18,000 students in 39 countries. And that I drew on all my friends around the world. I think there was something like 63 different scholars in we had 42 countries, but the data only matched for 39 as it turned out. But okay. Yeah, that was the other big. That one took
This is the
8
global
years. Yeah, that's volume
global
1.
report on only volume 1. Global report on student well-being. A survey of 18,000 students from 39 countries.
Yeah.
Rather amazing undertaking.
Yeah.
What were some of the obstacles to these undertakings that you had to work through?
Oh, in the first one, the material was overwhelming. I mean, because I had to learn about environmental science, I had to learn about criminology, I had to learn about media relations, and I had to learn about health and healthcare. A lot of fields that I didn't know about. That was challenging. And the other thing is, I couldn't go from. My original plan was to go from chapter 1 to chapter 2 and go through the 15 chapters. But the information wasn't coming in that way. It was coming in an ad hoc kind of way, because some of it I could get easy access to, and others I had to fish longer. And so if I tried to do it just chapter by chapter, I couldn't have done it at all. And so I just started to do the easiest things first. And so I was writing bits here and bits there, and hoping that it would all come together at the end. But in fact, that was a good strategy, because it did allow me to get the job done. And if I'd have tried to do it just from A to B to C the way I normally thought, that I wouldn't have been able to do it. And the other one, the 4-volume thing, was really an easier thing to manage. It was more simply structured. I had, as I said, over 60 people around the world helping me with it. The questionnaire was translated into 18 languages, and I had a single routine for managing the data from each university. We collected from university students, and in some countries we had from several universities. For example, in Taiwan, I had data from 26 universities.
Wow.
I had roughly $600 that I could spend in each country.
My gosh.
And I would just send them the $600 and say, do what you can with it. So the guy in Taiwan collected data in, I think it was something like about 2,600 students. He gave me that kind of data from 26 universities.
Wow.
And so I had a really nice sample of Taiwan students. And then I had about 1,500 students from the United States. I don't remember all the universities, but it was that kind of thing. And I did the same kind of routine analysis with every data set. So that was fairly easy to do compared to the other thing.
I see. And you had a lot of help, it sounds like, from some of your colleagues abroad.
Oh
Very
yeah,
generous help.
yeah, yeah. Doing the translations, for example, and again, and they only got $600. But I wrote to Glotzer and said, "Can you do this here?" And he had it translated into German. And there was a wonderful man named Rudolf von Dorke, who was the chancellor at the it used to be called, before the revolution, the Karl Marx University of Economics in Budapest. Now I think it's just University of Economics. But and Dorke translated the questionnaire into Hungarian and gave me back results. And I had people in Sweden and Norway and Egypt and Bahrain and Bangladesh, and they were all doing that. They were just great participants. And most of those connections were through the International Sociological Association.
Wonderful. My understanding from your work, and you've inspired so many people, is that you are a champion of subjective indicators, things that indicate the person's inner life, personal subjective experience. Can you tell us something about that and how that relates to more objective indicators of quality of life, like money or housing or things like that?
Yeah, actually, I'm a champion of both, which is a rare bird. I think that the quality of people's lives is a function of the actual living conditions that they're in and what they make of those conditions. And what they make of those conditions is a function itself of what they perceive them to be, how they think about them, how they feel about them, and then you take that stuff together, they form an evaluation of those conditions, and then they act, and then their actions have consequences on the conditions that they live in. The difficult thing is to keep focused on both the living conditions and what people are making of them. And if you take those two variables together, you get four interesting possibilities. The first is I call a real paradise, where people's living conditions are good and they feel good about them. And the fourth scenario is the worst one. I call that real hell, where people's living conditions are bad and they also feel bad about them. But the two interesting conditions are the middle ones. One is the fool's paradise, where a person's living conditions are really lousy, but they feel good anyhow. I think that's the classic fool's paradise. And the other one is the fool's hell, where things really are fairly good for people, but they're miserable anyway. And some people, one of the interesting things about our field of research is that when you talk to people about the quality of their lives and what should be measured, or when you talk to them about human well-being and what should be measured, there are some people who focus mainly on what's going on in people's heads, and there are some people who focus mainly on the living conditions without asking how the people feel about those. And there's a relatively smaller class who continue to focus on both things. And one of my missions now is to try to get people to continue to focus on both things. Personally, I find what's going on in people's heads a lot more interesting myself from my own research. But I think from the point of view of getting accurate measures of the quality of people's lives, you really do have to keep both things in mind. It's not enough, I think, to make people feel good about their lives. You really do have to get rid of poverty, and you do have to give people decent housing and decent health care and a long life. Those things are very important, and if we could just drug people and make them walk around with a smile, that doesn't quite cut it.
Very good point. Well, it makes me think then that we really need to focus on objective circumstances, something I recall Angus Campbell talking about, and Ed Diener and people like this. But once your basic living conditions are basically decent, then perhaps, I'm reminded of Milton's quote about the mind is its own place. It can make a heaven of hell or a hell of heaven. You see that operating as well.
Yes. Yeah, Diener and Veenhoven have done some really good studies just looking at people's incomes internationally. And I remember Diener has, just recently they produced a really good study. It was Ed Diener and Marty Seligman, and they looked internationally. If you plot people's income along the horizontal axis and their relative life satisfaction on the vertical axis, and you look internationally, once the per capita income hits about $10,000 a year, the graph goes straight up from zero per capita income to about $10,000 a year, and then it tends to level out, so that once you hit that mark, income doesn't have a big impact on people's satisfaction with their lives. What does have, across the board for all countries, if you look at the domains of people's lives and you ask them how satisfied they are with their living partner or with their family relations or their friendships, and also ask them how satisfied they are with their housing and their financial situation, their environmental quality, anything else you can measure, their interpersonal relations will impact, I would say at a minimum, 4 or 5 times more heavily on their life satisfaction than their income or their material goods or that other stuff. We are, this is Aristotle again, said we are social animals, and that's quite true. And when you do the comparisons about what's having an impact on people's lives, interpersonal relations is always much more powerful than anything else. The other thing is how they actually feel about themselves. In my city of Prince George, where we do an annual survey for city council, what we found year after year is that people's satisfaction with their own self-esteem is a very strong predictor of how their satisfaction with their life as a whole. So that the better people feel about themselves, the better they will report that their life is going generally.
Well, those are two very wonderful and valuable lessons. So having some self-esteem, basic self-regard. In psychology, we say a lot, it's the relationship that heals in psychotherapy, but maybe perhaps in general, it's relationships that heal and nourish us and give us a sense of fulfillment or happiness.
Yeah, a lot of people have done that. A lot of the work that we do in social indicators research and quality of life measurement is not particularly theory driven. we're short on theories. We borrow some from other people, but for example, there's been a lot of work on the impact of social support on people's well-being, and there's no question at all that having people around that love you, that care about you, that you can rely on in a pinch, is a crucial variable in determining people's quality of life, perceived quality of life.
Yes. Any other lessons from your research you'd like to share with us today?
I wish everyone was doing this. I came at it from a very personal point of view myself, in the search for the good life. But I'm also, from a moral point of view, I'm a consequentialist, or what old line utilitarian. That's the more familiar word. But I do believe that from a moral point of view, what we should be doing is trying to create the greatest good for the greatest number. And I think anyone who has that particular moral point of view, and for public policy making, that's a very good point of view to take. If you're really serious about producing the greatest good for the greatest number, then I think this research in quality of life is absolutely fundamental, because we are dealing with exactly how would you measure the greatest good for the greatest number. That's the problem.
So you're saying then Jeremy Bentham's maxim about greatest good for the greatest number could be a social policy rubric for government officials and the electorate to look at when they're making decisions.
Yeah, I mean that's what Bentham was, an active politician, and John Stuart Mill tried to be an active politician. He was active, but he wasn't that successful as a politician. But again, they were interested in improving the human condition, and they did have that little formula of the greatest good for the greatest number. And actually, Mr. Spock used to say that on Star Trek, the needs of the many versus the needs of the few.
Okay.
But it's not a bad rule. I mean, none of the rules are surefire, and you can, I taught ethics for many years, so I can play Ethics 101 and show you how all the theories fall apart in one way or another. But it's not a bad theory to start with.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Well, what constitutes the good life for you now on a more personal level?
This helps. I do like, I live, I enjoy my wife, but we're both workaholics, and we both enjoy our work, and we both have the same philosophy of life, that kind of utilitarian, Benthamite kind of point of view. And as long as I can continue the research and continue the active work in communities to make the world a better place, that's not bad.
Sounds like a pretty good life.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Mike. Sorry I broke up a couple of times.
It's quite all right.